Hello and welcome to the video lecture, The Second War for Independence, also known as the War of 1812. We're going to discuss some of the background here, why there was a war, some of the impact, etc. Now, as with any historical event, we need to look at context first. What was happening in the country at this time? Now, it's 1812, or a few years before. We're looking at that context. This is a fledgling republic trying to find its way. It's only been in this configuration since 1789, so this is a very young country. There were significant differences, regional differences, which mark some of the varieties of diversity that we see early on. One major example would be northeastern merchants and southern farmers. Now, these two groups had different interests, they had different priorities, and ultimately they would reflect different political sensibilities. And this would very much come to a head during the War of 1812, and we'll get to that. Be the end of one political party. The expansion that the country was facing at the time. Now remember, only a few years back the Louisiana Purchase was made. The nation had grown significantly, leading to a move westward. People sought economic opportunity, just as maybe some of you are in college right now to try to find economic opportunity. Some things never change, right? Anyway, many people sought opportunity. They moved westward. Population numbers in 1790, 3.9 million people in the country, 5% lived west of the Appalachian Mountains. 1820, only 30 years later, a population of 9.6 million, and 25%, or a quarter of those people, lived west of the Appalachians in 9 new states and 3 new territories. This expansion naturally led to increasing conflict in the West with Native Americans primarily, and through indirect ways, the British. There's a little foreshadowing. Democratic Republicans promoted expansion and their agenda facilitated it. For example, they provided funding for infrastructure, land for yeoman farmers, etc., etc. One other thing that we need to look at was not going on in the United States. That's what was going on in Europe, and those were the Napoleonic Wars. Notably Britain versus France, which expanded into the Americas as well. Neither truly supported American sovereignty or neutrality, blocking the path for American merchants to trade with the other nation. So the French would go out of their way to prevent our trade with the British, and the British would make sure we couldn't trade with the French. Now, this led to the embargo of 1807, which may have had good intentions, but was awful in practice. Europe did not depend on American goods. They were not going to stall their own conflict for our sake, or suddenly recognize our neutrality and thus theoretically weaken their own position. This would spur more division within the nation. American shippers and merchants, mostly from New England and mostly Federalists, became unhappy with this policy, became more aggressive, pushing their own agenda. This is part, again, of the diversity of the nation that we see even at this time. It shows that this diversity can lead to other challenges. The exacerbated political division would last into the war and again lead to the demise of one of the 2 major political parties. Thus, we have conflict in the West on the frontier. We have conflict in the East on the Atlantic Ocean, with no recognition of American independence, no international respect for our country. The British were aggressively assisting Native American tribes materially and economically to hurt the United States, which of course cannot be ignored. Again, simply put, Britain and France did not recognize our sovereignty. Britain being the more important one, right? Because who did we defeat in the Revolution? That's right, it was England. Now this is seen, this War of 1812 is seen as the traditional boundary between the early Republic and the early national periods, between the more hierarchical colonial world of the 18th century with the more dynamic 19th century American society, culture, and economy. There was no consensus regarding the war. The nation was divided as to whether to enter it, and truly the war would not offer any opportunity for I told you so's. It was seen as a political and military disaster for the United States, even though many positives emanated from it. And this is a little bit of irony, contradiction, however you want to look at it. This was no victory, right? We didn't outright defeat the British. We didn't gain more land, but we did gain some valuable successes from this, which we will get into. Now, one of the things that we need to start with were the causes, and I've already kind of touched upon one with the British helping Native Americans, but we're going to get a little bit deeper dive here, and I have 5 main reasons. First and foremost, Britain did not withdraw from American territory in the Great Lakes region as was agreed in the 1793 Treaty of Paris. Again, this only exemplifies this lack of respect for our sovereignty, but it shows that Britain was in our territory. They had promised to leave and they didn't. This is a problem. Number 2, again, Britain's assistance to Native Americans on the frontier, regardless of how you view the earlier treatment. This, of course, goes against our national interests, right? If we have constant wars coming on our frontier and they are assisted by, again, a country that did not recognize us. Number 3, Britain would not sign favorable commercial agreements with the United States, thus restricting commercial opportunities. Again, this was something that was established in the Treaty of Paris, which ended the American Revolution, and Britain simply ignored it. A 4th reason would be impressment. You've each read about impressment. Britain claimed the right to take any British sailors serving on American merchant ships. Okay. In reality, the British essentially kidnapped many American sailors, forced them to serve on British ships, claimed that they were British sailors. So, again, you have a country kidnapping another country's people. Number 5, the final reason I will provide here, harassment of American merchant ships by British ships. For example, in 1807, we have the firing on the Chesapeake, and this was one of many. So not only would Britain not sign these not make agreements with us as they were supposed to, as they had willingly agreed to, but they were harassing our ships, making it difficult for them to trade with anybody, and often leading to any kind of denial outright of such commerce. Now, indeed, the War of 1812 starts with a failed invasion of Canada in the summer of 1812. This would be repulsed by Tecumseh, Native American leader, and the British alliance. Part of the weakness of the invasion stemmed from domestic discord regarding the war itself. Governors of most New England states simply refused to allow their state militias to join a campaign beyond state borders. New Hampshire Congressman Daniel Webster even discouraged enlistment in the U.S. Army. Some might call this treason. But again, it goes to show that some of these New England states thought that they were bigger than the country or that they were the most important part of the country. They were not willing to sacrifice, not willing to give in when the country had declared war. Thus, this weakened our invasion of Canada, rendering it even more futile. This failed invasion contributed to the surrender of Detroit to the British in August 1812. A later attempt to attack Montreal would also fail. Now, there is one bright spot in the first year of the war, and that would be Admiral Oliver Hazard Perry's destruction of the British fleet on Lake Erie in September 1813. This forced the British to flee Detroit, but significantly offered a victory against the powerful British Navy. Now, the British Navy, of course, is the strongest navy in the world at the time, and they will continue to be so. The British were also defeated in October by a contingent led by future President William Henry Harrison at, you guessed it, Tippecanoe. It was here that Tecumseh, Native American leader and British ally, would ultimately die. Now, the British controlled the seas, and it would continue in this war. By August 1814, the British had sailed up the Potomac, had occupied Washington, D.C., even burning down the White House. But the British failed to capture nearby Fort McHenry. Francis Scott Key would, of course, write the Star-Spangled Banner while watching this failed invasion. This would become the national anthem in 1931. Now, a short time after this occupation of Washington, D.C., in December of 1814, 26 Federalists representing New England states, also known as the Essex Junto, met at what was known as the Hartford Convention to discuss how to reverse the decline of their party and their region. They voted to secede from the Union unless Congress repealed the embargo of 1813 and passed constitutional reforms that benefited them. Yes, let me repeat that. New England states voted to secede from the Union unless their demands were met. That might sound familiar here in a few weeks. Many viewed this as an act of treason, that New England states were seeking to remove themselves from the American ship as it was sinking. But a naval battle at Lake Champlain would serve as a deciding battle as Americans under Captain Thomas MacDonough defeated the British fleet there, forcing the British retreat into Canada. In England, the people had grown quite weary of war, both in Europe with the Napoleonic Wars and now in America with the War of 1812. The costs were significant, and because Napoleon was all but defeated at this time, there was no real popular support for the war. Negotiations would begin in August of 1814, actually, and to end the War of 1812. And on Christmas Eve, the Treaty of Ghent was signed in Belgium to end the war. What did this provide? Mutual restoration of territory based on pre-war boundaries. So neither side gained territorially, right? Neither side would really find any material or physical rewards from this war because of that. But we're going to get to some of the impact of that war in a little bit. So again, Christmas Eve, the treaty is signed in Belgium and the war is ended. But wait, what is going on in New Orleans? Who is this Andrew Jackson guy? The guy who would be known as King Andrew or Old Hickory later. If the treaty was signed on Christmas Eve 1814, why was there still a battle going on in January of 1815? Well, American forces led by Jackson were unaware of the signed peace treaty and completed a decisive victory over the British at New Orleans on January 8, 1815, a full 2 weeks after the signing of the treaty. There were 700 British casualties versus only 13 American deaths. Now, this had no diplomatic significance, but it sure helped Americans feel better about themselves. Obviously, it provides a new foundation for Andrew Jackson, depending on what he wants to do with his life, right? Now he's a famous general. And again, this is an interesting part of this. Obviously, nobody was texting, hey, the war is over, you can put your guns down, right? It takes a while for that news to travel. And this, again, significant victory over the British, even though it doesn't mean anything with regard to the war, the diplomacy, the treaty, et cetera, it still makes Americans, again, realize we can stand toe-to-toe with the British. Now, what do we see as the impact of the war? This is so important because you often hear people say, well, the War of 1812 is useless. Oh, my gosh. Nonsense. We're going to get to why. There was no clear-cut winner. No land changed hands, but it was a significant war in many ways, leading to what many would call victory in the bigger sense, thus its moniker as the Second War for Independence. This was a turning point in many ways. We survived a second war with our former colonial ruler, and in the process brought a nation of regions together to fight the war, except for those New Englanders, providing at least an initial sense of unity. The nation moved past the regions and their interests to help create a new sense of whole, further assisted by the end of the Federalist Party, providing some political unity in the country. I mentioned earlier that this is kind of seen as the line of demarcation, if you will, between what was known as colonial America and the new national period. So again, the Federalists come to an end because they're treasonous. They would not assist in the war. We established ourselves internationally, even though we had not fought to a decisive victory. The fact that we were able to defend ourselves against one of the largest and most powerful empires on the planet was quite significant, particularly when considering our naval competence in the face of the Great British Navy. Now, this would be the beginning of the emergence, again, of one Andrew Jackson, who would rule powerfully only a short time later. Most significantly, one could argue the war gave the young republic a new sense of confidence via this moral victory. The first few decades of the republic had been notably tumultuous. Political disagreement, internal dissent, France and Britain strong-arming us to get what they wanted, continued secondary status to this more powerful group of countries, and our own acquiescence in the face of their power. The quasi-war with France, the British seizure of American ships, the humiliation by French officials, our ability to maintain sovereignty and by doing so increasing international respect was quite a victory for the American psyche. It would also provide with it a new sense of nationalism, a new sense of pride in the country. I mentioned, even up to this time, and we'll see this up to the Civil War, you have regions. Many people define themselves by their state or by their region, but the country does show that it can come together in some ways. And we do see this new this new era of of nationality, of nationalism, of people saying we're a country, not just a group of regions. We also see, economically, the rise of manufacturing in the States. Embargoes and then war had limited our ability to trade with Europe. Thus, we needed to develop our own goods, leading to this initial foray into industry. This would only grow, of course, right? I have a video lecture on market economy, which gets into this expansion of the economy, this nationalization of the economy. When I say nationalization, not in a Marxist way, but just how it becomes more of a national output and an interdependence with the American system of manufacturing. But this manufacturing in general is going to change the nation going forward. For some, it will be not ideal. Folks like Jefferson, who espoused the ideal of the yeoman farmer. Democratic Republicans want this kind of country full of independent farmers who are self-reliant. But we see this development of manufacturing. Even Jefferson begrudgingly would admit earlier, obviously, that manufacturing would be somewhat necessary. But this manufacturing that starts at this time will develop over the course of the century. This will, of course, be essential in our growth in power, if you will, at the end of the 19th century, after the Civil War, after this class is over, but significantly also in the 20th century, World War I, World War II, and our role in those countries. So that is the Second War for Independence, again, also known as the War of 1812. Was it a useless war? Absolutely not. Was it a clear-cut victory? Absolutely not. But there were significant achievements that we see come from it. A lot of progress in many ways, again, politically, socially, economically, culturally. As an American culture, we have, again, this new sense of we stood up to the European bullies, even if we did not defeat them. This is the second war now that we have stood our ground and pushed them away. In the end, British would end impressment. They would stop helping Native Americans. And of course, they get out of the Great Lakes region. A little bit to the north, right, because they go into Canada. But again, these are significant changes that we see due to the war. Let there be no doubt.